Ever feel like history class, well, kind of skipped a few chapters?
I know that feeling.
Today we're diving into one of those stories you don't always hear about.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
You've asked us to unpack Jorge Majfud's The Wild Frontier. And let me tell you, the U.S. and Cuba and the Philippines back in the late 1800s. It's a wild ride.
It's one of those periods where it's not just about what happened, but how it got spun. Majfud does a great job peeling back the layers on that.
We're talking straight up yellow journalism era, right?
Oh, absolutely. And you can't talk about that without mentioning the granddaddy of them all, the USS Maine.
Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain. It's practically ingrained in our collective memory.
And that's exactly what makes it so fascinating. That slogan, it's catchy, it rhymes, it gets people fired up. But what Majfud highlights is who was doing the firing up. Newspaper giants like Hearst and Pulitzer, they weren't just reporting the news, they were battling it out for readers.
So instead of Twitter wars, we had front page brawls, basically. And the Maine. Perfect ammunition. Think about it. An American battleship explodes in Havana Harbor.
Instant outrage.
Exactly. Even though Captain Sigsbee, the ship's captain, he suspected an accident early on, and you'd think you'd have a clue, but Hearst's New York Journal. They slap a $50,000 reward on finding those responsible for the attack.
Talk about fueling the fire. Did anyone even question it back then?
Oh, there were skeptics. The New York Times, even back then, they called folks blaming Spain stupid.
No way.
Yeah, and later investigations pointed towards an internal explosion, probably in those coal bunkers near the ammunition.
Makes sense.
But a boring internal explosion, that doesn't sell papers like a Spanish conspiracy, does it?
So war it was. But Majfud doesn't just stop at the Maine, does he? He digs into the whole U.S. intervention in Cuba, and things get complicated.
It gets really uncomfortable really fast. See, while there was support for Cuba being free from Spain, it got messy when you started looking at who the U.S. wanted running a free Cuba.
It wasn't necessarily those doing the fighting. Exactly. It's like, okay, we'll help you get Spain off your back, but don't get any ideas about who's really in charge after.
Because a Cuba with, say, a significant Afro-Cuban population in power, that wasn't exactly a popular idea at the time, was it?
Let's just say it made certain people very, very nervous. Majfud even quotes someone saying they didn't want another Black Republic right on their doorstep.
Wow. Talk about saying the quiet part out loud.
It reveals those deep-seated fears and prejudices that were simmering beneath the surface. Don't forget, this is only a few decades after the U.S. Civil War. And for many, the Haitian Revolution, that successful slave revolt, that was still a haunting reminder of what could happen when racial hierarchies were challenged.
And to see a similar situation potentially brewing in Cuba.
Well, that was a risk some weren't willing to take. And you can't really separate this from what was happening within the U.S. at the time. Jim Crow laws, those weren't just popping up out of nowhere.
It's like this weird contradiction.
Yeah.
Fighting for Cuban freedom while actively trying to limit freedom back home.
Exactly. And this is where the Philippines comes in, because here, the U.S. goes from intervening to, well, taking over. No more playing nice.
Talk about adding insult to Spain, thinking they were on the same side.
Majfud calls it out for what it is, a flat-out betrayal. You've got Emilio Aguinaldo leading the Philippine Revolution. He's got this vision of an independent Philippines. And then, bam, the rug's pulled out.
And the things people were saying to justify it, it's unbelievable.
This is when that racist rhetoric goes into overdrive. Majfud quotes descriptions of Filipinos as this mix of Chinese and Negroes, inherently incapable of governing themselves. You even see that phrase, half devil and half child.
Dehumanizing.
Completely. And it's no coincidence. That kind of language is designed to make imperialism palatable. It's a lot easier to stomach if you believe you're the civilized ones bringing order to chaos.
Which brings us to guys like Senator Beveridge, President Roosevelt, the poster children for this kind of thinking.
Oh, absolutely. Beveridge, he's talking about a divine mandate for American expansion to regenerate the world. And Roosevelt, big stick diplomacy, that's all about projecting strength, asserting dominance.
But this regeneration came at a cost, right? For the Filipino people, this wasn't some bloodless revolution.
Not even close. We're talking about a brutal war. Majfud estimates nearly 1 million Filipinos died. 1 million lives. And the tactics used. Torture, village burnings. They even used expanding bullets, designed to inflict as much damage as possible.
Majfud tells this story about General Jacob Smith. After a Filipino attack, he supposedly tells his troops to kill everyone over 10.
Whether or not those exact words were spoken is debated, but the sheer brutality, that's not up for debate. It was horrific. But it's also important to remember, even back then, not everyone was on board with this. There were voices of dissent within the U.S., people horrified by what they were seeing.
People like Mark Twain. He was fiercely anti-imperialist.
Exactly. Twain, Andrew Carnegie, they saw the hypocrisy. Here is the U.S. built on this whole idea of breaking free from colonial rule, and now they're turning around and doing the same thing to others.
It's a good reminder that history is never simple. There are always different sides to every story. What's crazy is how these events, Cuba, the Philippines, they're worlds apart, but underneath it all, you see these same anxieties about race bubbling up.
And it's not just about who governs these places. It's about the fear of what happens if those populations become part of the U.S.
Especially in the South, the idea of giving citizenship to people considered, well, undesirable.
It was terrifying to some, and Haiti, that successful Black republic, that cast a huge shadow over everything.
It was living proof that the racial hierarchy so many clung to, it wasn't as stable as they wanted to believe.
It really messed with their whole worldview.
And it wasn't just Haiti. Majfud talks about how those fears, they popped up with Cuba, the Dominican Republic.
Even the Philippines. It all boils down to this idea that American citizenship, it wasn't for everyone.
Only those who fit a certain mold. And if you didn't, well, let's just say people like Senator Benjamin Tillman, who openly called for violence against Black Americans, they weren't shy about sharing their opinions.
It's a good reminder that these weren't just intellectual debates happening in some ivory tower. This was real life with real consequences.
So you've got this double standard, fighting against Spanish colonialism, while at the same time practicing their own version of it.
And they went to great lengths to control how people saw what they were doing, too. Majfud mentions how letters from soldiers, the ones describing the horrors they saw firsthand, the doubts creeping in, those often got censored.
Control the information, control the narrative. It's a tactic as old as time. Makes you realize how important it is to dig deeper, Get those different perspectives. Don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. And that's what makes Majfud's work so important. He's shining a light on those forgotten stories, the voices of those who resisted, who questioned, who paid the price for these imperial ambitions.
It's not always easy to face those uncomfortable parts of history, but it feels like we don't really have a choice, do we?
Not if we want to understand the world we live in today, because all of this, as long ago as it seems, those echoes are still here. That legacy of colonialism, the racism, the way power gets used, we're still dealing with those consequences.
It's kind of eerie how relevant it all feels.
Yeah.
The way information gets manipulated, the excuses used for getting involved in other countries' affairs, the anxieties about who belongs and who doesn't. It's like we're stuck on repeat sometimes.
It makes you wonder what we haven't learned, right?
Exactly. And that's why understanding this period, how the media, politics, and prejudice all collided, it's not just about looking back. It's about looking around and maybe, hopefully, making better choices going forward.
Couldn't agree more.
Majfud, he ends the book with this really powerful quote from Jose Marti, that Cuban revolutionary. He warned about the giant with the 7-league boots, talking about the U.S., how its desire to expand could have consequences that were felt far and wide.
And boy, was he right.
So to our listener, we've covered a lot of ground here. The sinking of the Maine, the U.S. and Cuba and the Philippines, the way racism shaped those events. It's a lot to unpack.
And we've just scratched the surface. But if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's the importance of digging deeper, asking those tough questions, and never taking anything for granted. History might not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
And sometimes those rhymes, they're pretty unsettling.